Strength from day to day. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our study of the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, the pre-Abrahamic history of the Bible. The material last week concerned the character of Noah, and that was recognized by God, and it fitted him to be the instrument of salvation of human life and also animal life from the devastation of the great flood. Noah is described as being righteous before God and blameless before men. As a man who walked with God and talked with God, he became an example of a man who fully obeyed God. His labors in the lead up to the flood spanned 100 years. Thus, Noah became an example of righteousness and obedience, even for Jesus in his teaching, and also for various New Testament writers. He is a significant part of our Bible narrative. Material for the lesson this evening will overlap some used last week, but will also move beyond it. If you wish to define our primary text tonight, it's from Genesis chapter 8, verse 18 through 9:17. The emphasis will be upon the condition of the post-flood world rather than upon Noah himself. The Genesis snapshot in time starts things moving that roll on through the ages and progress even to our day. God's promise to Noah still holds true. Quote, "As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease." Mankind has endured some very difficult plagues and wars, but never a cataclysmic disruption comparable to the great flood. Believers in God's Word daily walk their lives with confidence in God's promise, while unbelievers fret and tremble at their contrived signs of destruction. Now to your first handout sheet. Chapter 8, verse 20. Worship to God was job one for Noah as he stood on a cleansed new earth. Give thanks to whom thanks is due. Why an altar and burnt offerings? We can't be sure of that. But these offerings are completely different from the burnt offerings prescribed later under the law of Moses. Here, the Hebrew word indicates that which ascends. Later burnt offerings were used as food for priests and for worshipers. Chapter 8, verse 21. This ascending act of worship was received by God as being acceptable and pleasing. Note the extraction from Leviticus chapter 26, beginning with verse 27. If, in spite of all this, you still do not listen to me, but continue to be hostile toward me, I will take no delight in the pleasing aroma of your offerings. The lesson to all is that we must listen to God and obey Him before we expect God to be pleased with our offerings of worship. Also from this verse is the shocking thought from God that wickedness of man begins in childhood. This we can extend to think that righteousness also begins in childhood. And surely we have our own examples of this truth. But consider, if you will, this reading from Deuteronomy chapter 6, beginning with verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. Chapter 9, verse 1. An introductory thought to chapter 9 could be extended from this reading of chapter 8, verse 21. And here are comments from the Jewish commentary on that. Quote, "It being true that every inclination of man's heart is evil from childhood, and that I will never again destroy all living creatures because of this, God found that a covenant of laws is necessary to direct mankind toward righteousness. Thus, God's covenant with Noah." The command of chapter 128 is once again in order. The empty earth is now to be repopulated. Chapter 9, verses 2 and 3. A new relationship with animals is to be established. Note, the permission given to slaughter animals comes with restrictions. It does not license savagery. The purpose is specifically for food. And then verse 4 following it. A second restriction on manslaughter of animals is given. And at this point, anyone who's watching, if a discussion of blood is disturbing to you, turn your sound down now and I'll give you a hand signal to come back. One simple sentence from the text. You must not eat flesh with its lifeblood in it. That prohibition seems straightforward enough. However, it's been variously interpreted and is universally violated. As I grew up in a Christian farming community, there was consistent understanding and practice of this teaching. All animals slain for food were immediately bled out onto the ground after death and before butchering. As is said, this was done religiously. Not so now in the world in which we live, including our European relatives. I've looked this up. The internet can provide all manner of recipes for dishes such as blood pudding, blood sausages, and so forth. Many of these come from Germany and Ireland, but also include England. In other parts of the world, blood is drained from living animals to be drunk while hot. In a different vein, yeah, there's a pun there, and I have not proven this one, it is said that some interpret the prohibition to mean that a part of an animal is not to be eaten while that same animal remains alive or with its blood in it. my same Christian neighbors from my childhood may have violated this one as they ate mountain oysters. If you don't understand that, find an old person to explain it to you. On a nicer note, the prohibition under consideration became the basis for kosher foods. A simple sentence of text has been interpreted in many books and developed into a complex industry among our Jewish neighbors. Okay, come back now. Chapter 9, verse 5, reading, "For your lifeblood I will surely require an accounting." And here's the Jewish commentaries' comments on that one. Murder cannot be perpetrated with impunity. God himself calls the criminal to account. The Hebrew word here, with God as its subject, twice repeated for emphasis, is a powerful, evocative expression connoting relentless pursuit until punishment is meted out. Perhaps you've heard that the motto of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police is this: we always get our man. And in the case of murder, God promises to do exactly that. In this covenant that God made with Noah, murder is codified as a law. That's in chapter 9, verse 6. Capital punishment is the prescribed penalty for murder. The perpetrator cannot be ransomed with money. And that from Numbers chapter 35, verse 31, reading, "Do not accept a ransom for the life of a murderer who deserves to die. He must surely be put to death." End of reading. The prohibition given against murder in verse 6 is based once more on the fact that man's life is sacred because he is made in the image of God. The Bible never sanctions the death penalty for any other class of crime as far as I know, and if I've missed one, please correct me. Chapter 9, verses 8 to 11. The key term in these verses is covenant. It is used 7 times. It's addressed to all mankind through Noah with his descendants. It is a solemn, unilateral pledge from God that he will never again destroy the earth. It was declared to have no ending date. God's pledge is guarantee number 1. Pardon. And in chapter 9, verses 12 to 17, the second guarantee is the rainbow set in the heavens. See the rainbow and remember God's covenant. Don't fear total destruction when you see rain clouds approaching. God's message from the heavens now is not destruction, it is hope. God remembers the people he has created. Now shift gears. We're going to a piece now that's been looking for a time slot in this series. It's marked your handout number 10-2. And this sheet is my effort to graphically represent the reality of chapter 5, which just looks like a very uninteresting genealogy. It's easy to read the genealogy of that chapter without getting its significance. As previously mentioned, this is in Scripture because it is the pre-flood ancestry of Christ. However, it also potentially answers a lot of questions people have posed, such as, where did the sons of Adam find their wives? Okay. This is, if you want to get a little understanding of the sheet, generally speaking, we're going to begin explanation by starting at the lower left corner and working our way up and toward the right. The far left column begins keeping time at the bottom and proceeds to the top. Multiply those numbers by 100 to get the year as we state years today. The first date indicator given in the text is from chapter 5, verse 3, reading, "When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth." This sentence raises a lot of questions, and it also gives some answers, and we'll try to look at a few of each. Question: did this life of Adam include the time in the garden? I doubt that. The carnal storyline of earthly ancestors of Jesus would seem to begin with the paragraph of chapter 3, verses 21 to 24. God's concern with prevention of man's accessing the tree of life sealed man's destiny on earth as being temporal, time-limited. Death loomed in front of Adam and all mankind following him. So, in one sense, this begins mortal man. Okay, here's an answer from our reading. The men mentioned in the genealogy of chapter 5 are not necessarily firstborn sons. That passing of the birthright to the firstborn son did not seem to be in effect until a later time, illustrated by the sons of Adam. We know that Adam and Eve produced sons, Cain and Abel, before Seth. So Seth, in the ancestry of Christ, was not the firstborn son of Adam and Eve. Here's a question. How many children did Adam and Eve produce before Seth? We will never know. It's highly unlikely that they had only 3 sons to be born in 130 years. After God had commanded them in chapter 1, verse 28, quote, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth." Question: how many daughters were born to Adam and Eve in this 130-year period? Well, as we know, it's likely that the number of daughters were equal to the number of sons. That's pretty basic. They're not mentioned, but later statements would indicate this to be true. So here's a speculation. Did brother marry sister? Certainly they did. Adam and Eve were genetically equal by the way in which God created Eve. She was created from Adam's body. They were also genetically perfect. God looked at them and said, they are very good. So, biologically speaking, there was no reason for a brother not to marry his sister in generation 1 and 2. Question: why is it necessary to restate of Seth in his own likeness, in his own image? Were not the prior births also of Adam's image? Could this have the same meaning as when God created Adam in his own image? Could Seth have been a singular child born with a spirit that communed with God. Think about it. Okay, back to the sheet. The blue column under each man's name indicates his time from his birth to the time of birth of his chosen son. So the little horizontal line runs across two columns from the age at which the father bore the son to the birth of his chosen son. That's why the text divides, that's the way the text divides each life. Then above that little line, the red column indicates the period of a man's life described in the text in chapter 5, verse 4. And we'll use this as an example, but it applies all the way across. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years, and get this, and had other sons and daughters. That's a hard one to get your head around. Would you like to guess how many children Adam and Eve had totally during their lifetime? This is the best opportunity that's given in the pre-flood period to make a calculated guess at that very number. You'll have to stick with me on this one. This could be considered actually the minimum number of children that they had. Okay, here it goes. Adam had 3 sons and so 3 daughters in 130 years. Use that as the means for calculating births also during the 800 years they lived, having other sons and daughters. So the calculation would go something like this. 800 years divided by 130 years times 6, plus the 6 that were born before the 800 years began, and you wind up with a number of 43 births for Adam and Eve. Drop the 3 as those who did not make it to reproductive age. So the multiplication factor for each human being, Adam and Eve, would be 20. The population of each generation following Adam and Eve then is 20 times the one before it. That means in generation 7, the population of the earth would have been, are you ready for this number? 64 million people. And then that population line would have really started going up. Of course, there's also the possibility of many factors intervening, both positive and negative, and we know nothing about that. Now move to the notes on that same sheet on the right-hand side. Chapter 5 gives us numbers that easily add up to a time for the flood. The chart plainly shows it to be shortly after 1700 years. That's 1,700 years. The numbers given for Adam set the pattern for all the others. The record of the genealogy of Jesus begins with Adam and moves through his son Seth. Now, if we skip on forward in that genealogy to King David, this lineage does not follow the rule of the firstborn son. As a matter of fact, David was the youngest in his family, 1 Samuel 16, verse 11. In his choice to be king, we learn how God chose men. 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, second half of the verse. Quote, "The Lord does not look at things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Enoch is perhaps the first illustration that a successful life before God is not measured by the number of days, but by faithfulness to God. Jesus is the most outstanding example of this. We've discussed the reproductive record of Noah. And here's my concluding thought for this lesson, and this one's conjecture too. We've already noted that Jesus was conscious of the story of Noah's singular place in the history of mankind. I am made to wonder if Jesus did not also have Noah in mind when he taught in Matthew 7:13 and 14, quote, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." End of reading. In my imagination, I see the tiny ark floating alone on a mighty expanse of empty water with no salvation in sight. I think I can hear the great chorus of voices in agony crying, "Why didn't we believe Noah and what he had to say?" And how about our world today? That's it for this lesson, and I hope you'll join us again next week.
Gracious.